Now we were discussing the characteristics of a spiritually elevated soul. A real yogi who has completely succeeded in controlling the senses and also diverting his mind to the spiritual direction. One example mentioned in the Gita is Sthita Prajna. This is the second chapter, the discussion of the characteristics of a Sthita Prajna, a spiritually elevated soul who is fully established in spiritual wisdom. In real action, how does he look like? How does a spiritually elevated person, established in the ideal of complete non-attachment with whatever he does, and who is able to do everything, physical, mental and intellectual activities, as an act of worship? How does he behave? There are two misunderstandings, two wrong ways of interpreting the state of such a spiritually elevated soul. One possible misinterpretation is that such a soul becomes totally insensitive. This is a very carelessness or total indifference. The synthesis of action and detachment, which Lao Tzu calls the way, that's what he calls. The art of doing nothing, as he calls. The way, sometimes put in the capital letter W. That's the central philosophy of Taoism. How can we achieve and be established in the way, the art of doing nothing? But really speaking, it is neither total inaction in a literary sense or total insensitivity towards what is going around. One important characteristic of a spiritually elevated person is that he'll be extremely sensitive in a very humane way. Sometimes we interpret a spiritually elevated person with the grim expression, stoic expression, the granite face. You will say you won't be moved by anything and won't worry about what is going around. A spiritually elevated person does worry about what is going around. One of the greatest persons the world has seen was Jesus Christ, who was so much worried about what was going around. All the great spiritual personalities the world has produced were so much worried about what was going around, they were not worried about themselves, that's all. In fact, we can worry about others in a very spiritual sense only when we stop worrying about ourselves. Very often we worry about ourselves so much that we have no time to worry about anything else. So, Lord Krishna, with deep psychological insight, gives a graphic picture of such a yogi. So, as I quoted in the last class, the 18th verse of the 4th chapter, Karmani akarmaya pasye, akarmani cha karmayaka, sabuddhiman manusheshu, sayukta krishna karma krita. This is actually the picture of a yogi living in this world. And if there is one word used here in this verse, if you see the Sanskrit, yukta means yogi, the 4th verse. Buddhiman means a spiritually intelligent person, a spiritually elevated person. And then another characteristic of a yogi is, the Sanskrit term used is Krishna karma. Literally means Krishnam karma karoti iti Krishna karma. That's a definition given by the Sanskrit grammarians, which means the one who does everything. So he is doing everything. In other words, he is not indifferent. A yogi, karma yogi, is not indifferent, negligent or inactive or lazy. So how do you explain the way of doing it, nothing, the art of doing nothing? That is explained here. The art of doing nothing while doing everything. So, and this is achieved by a technique which is called in Bhagavad Gita non-attachment. This simple technique enables us to remain doing nothing while doing everything, because it enables us to be truly intelligent in a spiritual sense. Now, Shankaracharya discusses this point in his commentary. In fact, some of the great thinkers, philosophers belonging to the rival schools put forward some objections to this. How is it humanly possible to do nothing while doing everything? How is it humanly possible to see action in inaction and inaction in action? Don't you think it is a contradiction in terms? It is something that is intellectually, even from a linguistic point of view, is nonsensical. I mean, to see action in inaction and inaction in action. Now, while explaining this part, he gives an imagery. The imagery of a person traveling in a boat, in a river. In fact, he gives this example to show that it is really possible for us to see things in a different way. Illusion is always possible. So, it is possible even in ordinary human experience to see action in inaction and inaction in action. So, as I said, the imagery. Suppose you are traveling in a boat, you find that the objects close to you, if you are traveling very close to the bank of the river, you find that trees and buildings near the river, near the bank of the river, moving the opposite direction. They are not moving the opposite direction. We are actually moving, but we don't feel that we are moving forward. Now, if you look at mountains at a distance, you feel, well, they are not moving. You don't feel their movement, but you see the objects close by moving the opposite direction. Now, and if you are traveling in the evening, late evening, when there is moonlight around, and you look at the moon or stars, you find they are moving forward. So that there are three types of illusions taking place here. We are moving, which we don't feel. The trees are seen to be moving the opposite direction. In fact, they are not moving. The mountains, maybe a few miles, several miles away, are seen to be remaining steady without movement. And the moon above, maybe long distance away, may be moving forward. These are three types of illusions that we normally experience. This is the example which Shankaracharya gives. I shall read that very famous portion just to give an example. How this idea is explained. Before coming to the text, another important idea that is put forward by great interpreters like Aurobindo and Gandhi should be also understood. Of course, both of them following the footsteps of Shankaracharya, the great non-dualistic philosopher. How do we practice this art of seeing action in action and inaction in action? Suppose we are doing a lot of work, always engaged in different activities, getting tired. Very often, this feeling of being tired, or bored, or being exhausted comes to the mind only when we remind ourselves of the amount of work we have done. I have done so much. Immediately, we become aware of the fact that our body is tired. Why? Because who was doing the work? The body, and of course the senses of action and senses of perception and mind were involved in this action. Now when we make the statement, I have done so much, so I feel tired, dejected, exhausted, and if the result is not up to the expectation, we feel depressed. This happens when we tell ourselves, I have done so much. And this I here means the psychophysical mechanism. So long as we identify ourselves with this psychophysical mechanism of this body, we feel tired. So action becomes the cause of depression or disappointment when the result is not up to the expectation. Now, suppose along with that we can keep in our mind, we can remind ourselves of the fact that we are something beyond this body, beyond this mind, beyond this sensory system, and we are the Atman, the Supreme Consciousness, which is immanent in all beings, which is omnipresent. At that time, we don't feel so much of tiredness or exhaustion. Body may require rest from another point of view. The body is after all made of 5 elements. Body has to follow the rules of the 5 elements, which are subjected to change, part of the law. But the moment we identify ourselves with something other than this body, mind and intellect and the senses, at that very moment, the feeling of tiredness, the feeling of being exhausted, that goes away. Now, this is possible only by slowly reminding ourselves of the fact that we are something beyond the psychophysical body. The method is explained in the succeeding verses, which I already started taking up in the last class. Arjuna's question. How does a yogi, how does a man of spiritual wisdom, how does he function in this world? A few important characteristics were explained. One is that such a person becomes completely detached and he removes all the desires of the mind, and within his mind he has a strong conviction that is something beyond the physical body, is the Atman, and this feeling of Atmanhood, the conviction that we are the all-pervading, immanent, everlasting reality, this enables us to remove all the desires from the mind. That is stated in the 55th verse, which you already described last class. Then in the 56th verse, there is a description. Dukkeshu anudvikna manaha, sukheshu vigaraspruha, vidaraga bhaya krodha, siddhirma niruchyate, yes sarvatra anabhisnega, tattat prapya shubha shubham, na abhinandadi, na dveshti, tasya prajna padisthita, yada samkharadechayam, kurvam ganiva sarvasa, indriyani indriyarthebhya, tasya prajna padisthita, vishaya vinivartante, niraharasya dehinaha, Rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. These are 4 verses which we are going to take up. Just we need not bother much about the verses. The idea is this. First, I shall give literal translation, then we will explain the extended meaning. Such a person's mind, a yogi's mind, is not shaken by any adversity, and he doesn't hanker after any happy experience. And he or she has become completely free from affection. Remember, not insensitivity. Affection here means obsessive attachment to individuals or anything. That's what is meant by. Sometimes literal translation can be terribly misleading. So that's because translators very often may not have enough space to give the full extended meaning. So a yogi should be free from affection means he should be cold-blooded, heartless. No. He is attached to everyone in this world. So he so he is said to be free from any kind of selfish affection or obsession towards anybody. He is so humanistic, and his humanism is so universal, and he is so free from any kind of obsessive attachment towards anything or anybody. It means he is so free from selfishness, self-orientation, that his love goes for all, is meant for all. He looks upon entire humanity as one spiritual family, which we normally understand by the term universal spiritual humanism. In that sense, that yogi becomes completely free from any kind of obsession or attachment towards anything. And not only that, he remains unattached, and he is not pleased when something good happens, and he is not vexed, he is not worried when something opposite happens, because his wisdom is fully fixed. And then, of course, we explained other verses. The 59th verse says, objects fall away from this yogi, leaving longing behind. But this longing also ceases, who sees the Supreme. This needs some explanation. The point is this: normally, when we try to practice non-attachment, unselfishness, we are able to do it in a physical and mental sense often. And we may be able to deny ourselves certain things, and we can practice renunciation, non-attachment. But within the mind, there is a lurking desire. Something remains in the mind. Though we are not able to, we are not interested in getting those things, we are not going out of the way to obtain selfish ends, physical comforts. We are not too much attached to getting physical comforts alone. Apparently we are able to practice some amount of self-restraint. Still, within the mind, that subtle desire continues to linger. This lurking desire remaining within the mind sometimes comes to the surface. That's why we know very often, after practicing spirituality and meditation for a long time, sometimes there will be sudden deviation from, or suddenly we feel bored, mentally exhausted. So, and sometimes we just suppress, we don't sublimate the mind, we just suppress the desires within, which may again come to the surface if there is a tempting situation, and that creates much more problems. This subtle desire vanishes, disappears, only when a person reaches spiritual realization. A few examples from modern commentators and thinkers can be very helpful in understanding. Say, Gandhiji once wrote in Young India, fasting and similar discipline is one of the means to the end of self-restraint, but it is not all. And if physical fasting is not accompanied by mental fasting, it is bound to be hypocrisy and consequent disaster. It's a very interesting thing. Physical fasting sometimes can be counterproductive without any mental restraint. So, the technical term that is used in Vedantic tradition for fasting is upavasa, which actually means living close to God. That's the real literal meaning, living close to God, literal meaning. But normally we understand it as practicing fasting, abstinence from eating. Now, Gandhiji elsewhere made a statement, an attempt to forcibly control the senses by taking them away from the objects of desires without any effort to practice inner discipline can sometimes be counterproductive, as I said. That's why sometimes, people practice a lot of austerities like fasting and so on, and they become very proud of it. And sometimes they would say, well, see, I'm fasting, I'm doing, see, all these fellows are eating 4 times, 5 times a day, but I'm fasting. So Gandhiji refers to this, this kind of spiritual pride. In fact, that fasting is worse than taking regular meals every day at the appointed time and practicing spiritual sadhana, spiritual practices. So there Gandhiji says that the real fasting is fasting of the mind, training the mind, practicing self-restraint. By sublimating the mind, it may or may not be accompanied by the physical act of abstinence from food, but real fasting is nothing but purification of the mind through sublimation. That's a very important point which Gita makes clear in this verse. So that's why Gita gives a very scientific and very rational interpretation to the very concept of spiritual austerity. Bhagavad Gita is not in support of extreme self-torture or any kind of spiritual practice. That cannot make a person a real yogi. Complete forcible abstinence for even the bare necessities of life cannot make you a yogi. What Gita preaches is the ideal of moderation, which later on Buddha took up in a big scale, in a big way, and made one of his central themes in Buddhist philosophy, the middle way it is called. So, in the Gita sloka is the yukta akara vikarasya, yukta cheshtasya karmasu, yukta swapnavabodhasya yogo bhavati dukkha. The ideal is a moderation. Who is a yogi? Who is a spiritually elevated person? He is not necessarily one who completely abstains from bare necessities and lives an extremely ascetic life without any human sensitivity, but at the same time remaining proud of his or her austerities. Rather, a person who practices moderation in activities, in action, and also in rest, moderation in everything, that alone can take the mind away from the tyranny of senses, from the world of senses. The path of yoga, as I said at the very beginning, is the path for freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom from the tyranny of the senses. Freedom not for the senses, but freedom from the senses. Now, suppose we physically practice extreme austerity, but mind is not ready for it. Then mind will be always complaining. The path of yoga ought to enable us to take the mind away from body consciousness. If we practice extreme physical austerity, and if the mind is not ready, then a starving man, if he tries to meditate, he will be meditating on food only. That's a reality. I mean, fasting becomes starving when fasting is practiced by a person who is just physically engaged in the art of non-eating. That's all. So, Gita says the real yogi is one who practices moderation in action and also in rest. So he should not be lazy, he should be active. But a hyperactive person cannot be a yogi. Unless he has become already a yogi, he cannot become a yogi through extreme activity. Maybe a person who has reached the highest yoga will be extremely active, because, as I said earlier, he will be able to experience inaction even when he is busy engaged in all activities. He can go on working. That is what all the great spiritual teachers teach. In fact, they worked much more than any ordinary human beings. the amount of work they did was so much. Physically, even physical work, much more than any ordinary human beings. But they were not affected because they could see inaction in action. And also action in inaction. Well, I explain this later, this point, because it's something I just mentioned at the very beginning. So, after reaching the highest peak of spiritual illumination, one can be active 24 hours of the day, physically, mentally and intellectually. Because he or she won't be affected. All the great yogis, all the great spiritual personalities were yogis. Remember, I should remind you again and again, by the word yogi, we don't mean those who practice the physical exercise part of yoga. That is certainly helpful, but yoga, by the word yoga, we mean a total and complete philosophy of life, full of harmony, peace, action, but internal tranquility. That is what we mean by yoga. In that sense, all the great spiritual teachers of the world were yogis. Not necessarily those who were reading Bhagavad Gita. Oh, in that case, Buddha was a yogi, Jesus Christ was a yogi, the mystics who lived in Middle Ages were yogis. Not only the ascetics of India, anybody who practiced the higher spiritual wisdom is a yogi. So yoga has got a very rational, scientific and comprehensive meaning and implication in this sense. And what they did, they elevated their own personality beyond the physical level and reached the spiritual level. And that was possible because they could sublimate their mind to a higher spiritual level. And this is possible only by the practice of moderation, because the aim in yoga is to go beyond the body. That's a simple aim, to go beyond the body. If our mind is not ready, and if we practice extreme austerity, then body will always remind you of some problem. I am hungry, give me food. That's how we feel hungry, so we'll be meditating on food, as I said last time. So, Lord Krishna says, the real yogi is one who practices moderation in action. He is not hyperactive. Those who are given to action, those who are always active and very proud of it cannot be yogis. They may be either highly advanced yogis, but they cannot be aspirants for yoga. Either they are highly advanced spiritual personalities who are established in yoga, who have reached the goal, but they cannot be sincere seekers if they are practicing extreme action. And if they are lazy, then also they cannot be yogis. If they are given to overeating, they cannot be yogis. If they are always fasting, they cannot be yogis. That's the idea behind. That's why Gandhiji says, fasting of the mind means restraining the mind, sublimating the mind beyond the bodily level. So there is a quotation from St. John of the Cross, which Gandhi quotes, I am not speaking here of the absence of things, for absence is not detachment if the desire remains. That's the implication of the 59th verse. That means when a person starves his senses, the objects of the senses may disappear from him, but he'll have a strong desire lingering with him. That remains there. Therefore, what is needed is not physical abstinence, physical separation from the objects of desire or senses. But what is required is sublimation of the mind. It is this that sets the soul free. That means detachment based on elevating the mind, detachment achieved through elevating the mind from the physical level. That is the only path to freedom of the soul. You see that from a most unlikely source, you can get the definition of yoga in action from St. John of the Cross. It is this that sets the soul free even though possession may be still retained. So one can be active. You can be the richest man in the world, or woman in the world. You can be yogi if you are not proud of it, if you are not attached to this. So there is an interesting episode quoted in the Mahabharata from the life of an emperor. He's a king, Janaka, one of the richest men in those days. He was a king, he was an emperor. And he was sitting in his court. So somebody rushed to the hall and shouted at him, "See, the city is on fire." Now, Janaka didn't bother much. With a cool mind, he arranged for putting out the fire. But there were smaller people. These villagers had come to see him, maybe with some grievances. Poor people had already assembled for the free food that he used to offer to thousands of people, the king. They ran to their homes in small huts. They were eager to protect them. And the king did not bother much. King calmly made arrangements for putting on the fire. It doesn't mean that people should not look after their things, they should be indifferent. But the illustration, the story has only one central message. Detachment doesn't mean physical separation from things. It is possible for one to be established in non-attachment even if he or she possesses a lot of wealth. Still you can practice non-attachment. That is central message here. And there is another interesting quotation from Plotinus, the Neoplatonist. He says, "But when we do behold him, then we obtain the end of our wishes and rest." The idea is, when we spiritually progress, we reach a level of inner contentment. And at that time, we are able to detach our mind from lower things. Then also, we are no longer discordant, but perform a truly divine dance about him. The idea is, we are able to do all the work, perform all the duties and responsibilities. Still, we can look at the whole thing as a play through this mechanism of total non-attachment. That's the idea indicated here. Now we will come to the verse again. I shall just give an example. Just a short description of how this is actually practiced in the life of a yogi. That's what I'm going to. As I told you earlier, the real yogi is one who practices, who can see action in inaction, inaction in action. How this is really made possible. So, I gave the example from the imagery of a boatman, a person traveling in a boat trying to cross the river. Just a few. The verse comes in the 4th chapter, is the 18th verse. This paradox of acting without doing anything. Doing anything means non-attachment. Acting means action. So action and doing nothing. That is being practiced here. That is one who sees inaction in action and action in inaction. Is intelligent among human beings. He or she is a yogi and doer of all actions. This is the quotation. Now, how this is really made possible? The first condition is, first of all, we must define our own personality, who we are. This is the first condition. So, at the beginning, the Gita says a normal human being may define himself or herself as a physical body. That's normal understanding. So when we walk, we tell ourselves, well, I'm walking. When we take rest in an easy chair, we tell ourselves, well, I'm sitting, I'm now engaged in action. Here, action and inaction, these two words are interpreted purely at the physical level. When we walk or when we do some physical activity, our senses are engaged in activities, and the activities performed by the senses, the body mechanism, are attributed to our own self when we define ourselves as a physical body. And when we are not doing anything, when sitting in an easy chair, we tell ourselves, well, right now I am doing nothing. In both cases, we are interpreting ourselves as a physical body. Then Gita gives another example. When we become angry, annoyed, happy. Well, I'm happy. We do not mean the body is happy. We don't mean the body is angry. We mean something other than the body. And we associate this anger or unhappiness with something other than the body. That is mind. So, from body we have gone to mind. Now, so long as we interpret ourselves as the physical body, we cannot remain active all the time and experience peace of mind. The central theme is how to combine action and contemplation, how to be active all the time, whether we are working in an office, in a factory or university, whatever work we are engaged in. How to remain active and at the same time enjoy peace of mind within. That is the subject we already explained in the early classes. Now, in both these cases, it is not possible to practice action and inner peace within, because action is always associated with some degree of anxiety, worry about the result of what action we are doing. It is unavoidable. Now, at another stage, if we can define our own personality as something other than the body or mind, as something which is not engaged in any action, then we can be always active. At the same time, through this mechanism of this mental or psychological mechanism of non-attachment, we can sublimate, we can elevate our personality from the physical, mental, intellectual and the spiritual level. And when we define ourselves as a spiritual entity, we can say, well, my senses are active, I am not active. My body is engaged, I am not engaged. This is what Gita says. This has got two dimensions. I am not dealing with the first one, those who are highly established in this. If you are talking about the great people, Gandhi or any of these great men, Buddha, anybody, they could do so much in terms of activity in their own personal life and also in terms of the contribution to humanity as spiritual teachers or prophets. Now, they did all this when they reached the highest level of yoga. But for common people, Gita says this is possible by the mechanism of surrendering the fruits of work. Whatever work we are doing, mentally giving this result of our work to God, if we believe in God, or consider this as an act of worship, as a contribution, as an act of service to humanity at large. These are the two options which Gita gives. Gita is so great that Gita doesn't insist that one should worship God every day. Gita is of course a very theistic book. It's a book about God realization. But when Gita talks about yoga, Gita says one can even practice this yoga without formally becoming religious minded, without becoming part of religion as it is normally defined. I mean, defined in terms of a book, a ritual, or formal profession of faith in a creator God. That's one important contribution of Gita. One can practice yoga even if one is not a theist. That's one important contribution. Now, in the 61st and 62nd verse, Gita gives a very psychological interpretation of how we normally get attached to worldly things. What are the obstacles in yoga? The two verses, Dhyayodo Vishayan Pumsaha Sangaste Shubhajayade Sangar Sanjayade Kamaha Kama Krodho Vijayade Krodha Bhavadi Sammoha Sammoha Smriti Vibhramaha Smriti Bhramsha Buddhinashu Buddhinasa Pranashari. So 65th and 66th verse. 62nd and 63rd. It's a gradual degradation of the mind. The picture is given. First we think of objects, then attachments, and then from attachments a strong longing and desire. And when what we desire, what we long for is not achieved, anger creates delusion, and from delusion we lose our memory and the mind degenerates. This is what happens. Now we come to the verse. Now the question arises, how do we get attached to the objects of the world? Gita says through constant contemplation. Sometimes some interpretation modern times has raised a question about the rationality of the statement. Do we get attached through constant contemplation to sense objects? Or do sense objects drag our mind? Gita says, sense objects do not drag the mind. When we see different things, our mind is not dragged towards those objects. When we see the same objects, even when those objects have disappeared from our vision, when still they are not visible, still if our mind is contemplating those objects, it is this contemplation, this lingering focus on the sensory objects that continues even after these objects have vanished from our sight. It is this contemplation, this focus, this pondering over sense objects that creates attachment. This is a very interesting point at Gita's great contribution to psychology. Any book you find here, when we see an object in front of us, they would say, these objects drag the mind. These objects may drag the eyes, but the eyes can see different objects without mind being dragged along with it. It is possible by practicing a kind of detachment, severance between the senses of perception like eyes and the mind. That's why a great yogi can work anywhere, can sit in a marketplace and still practice meditation. He may be seeing around him different objects which normally drag the mind, will create problems. But if a yogi is focused on something higher within, that's why he is able to see everything. If you have seen Ramana Maharshi's photo, it is one classic example. There are many great yogis, but one classic example, if you find Ramana Maharshi's photo, you find he is sitting there and he is looking at something, apparently. In fact, he will be always surrounded by people around him. Sometimes there will be quarrels also, in fact, his ashramas. Sometimes there is state, how difficult it was. But he will be sitting there, seeing all this, hearing all this, but his mind is somewhere away. That is what attracted people. It is said, to give an illustration of how the kind of atmosphere in which he practiced yoga. I can give an example. 2 cooks started fighting in the kitchen. 2 employees. Each took the huge pitchfork and started beating each other. And each one asked the other one, "Do you know who I am?" So each one shouted at the other, "Do you know who I am?" Then Ramana Maharshi went to them, "See, we are all trying to find an answer to this question." So in fact, Ramana Maharshi's method was, "Who am I?" And so I'm just giving this example to illustrate. And Ramana Maharshi could practice yoga in the midst of this situation. So that means it is possible for us to live in a factory, to walk in the streets of San Francisco, or to work in an office, deal with people who may not necessarily be yogis, not even spiritual seekers, and still practice yoga. In fact, that is the ideal. And as I said at the beginning, Shankaracharya in his commentary gives a very interesting insight into its practical application. Shankaracharya discusses this point. Now, if you read these verses and the literal translations, either you think, well, these are not meant for us. These are all. Either you may think these are absolutely unpractical, absolutely impossible. Or you may perhaps think, well, this is meant for highly elevated souls, of not much relevance to us in our own day-to-day life situations. So, anticipating this problem, Shankaracharya gives a solution. He says, all these ideas which are explained in this second chapter, from 55th to 72nd verse, 18 verses, all these ideas become natural characteristics for a highly elevated soul. But you need not leave it at that. They can be taken up, they can be read, and you can contemplate on them, and you can slowly try to keep in the mind that these are the things that we have to achieve. If you keep this in mind somewhere in the corner, that will help us to slowly practice this. So even if you are practicing in a factory or a university or any ordinary working place, not necessarily in a place of meditation or a spiritual center, in the midst of ordinary activities, if we can keep in mind some of these ideas, slowly we will be able to link these ideas to our normal life situations. That is also practice. That's a sign of a yogi. A yogi is not one who practices spirituality within the Vedanta Society or in a church or in a temple or in the worship room or 2 hours in the morning and evening. He is not a yogi who limits his spiritual life to 3-4 hours in the day, morning and evening, within a well-defined, well-conditioned place necessarily conducive to the practice of spirituality. Not necessarily. A yogi is a one who practices this 24 hours of his life. That is what is called yoga. Then only yoga becomes a path of freedom. So yoga is, in other words, is a kind of the art of spiritualizing our everyday common life situations. So Shankaracharya says, first we must study these things and then contemplate. And we can read, or if we can't read, some of these ideas could be kept in our mind, that we should not worry when there is a dilemma in front of us. We should not worry when there is a setback. We should not worry when there is there is an unfortunate, unpleasant experience. Because all this unpleasantness or setbacks take place at the physical or mental level. And we are, in fact, not the physical bodies, not even the minds. We are something that goes far beyond the body and the mind. And such a person is not worried is not bothered. That's why, if the earlier verses, it is stated, Vishaya vinivartanti niraharasya dehineha rasavarjam rasopyasya param drashtva nivartade. So, dukkeshu anudviktamana sukheshu vigadaspura. So, when you are not worried too much when there is an unpleasant experience, and is not overjoyed when there is a happy experience. So, we will be able to take both unhappiness and happiness in our stride. Why? By establishing a connecting link between our everyday life situation and these great spiritual ideas. That is what is called yoga. So that should be kept in mind. Yoga is not a religion. That is to be kept in mind. Yoga is not a religion. Well, among many other things, yoga also may be interpreted as a religion, but it goes far beyond what we normally understand by the word religion. Yoga is altogether a way of life. Just changing our whole focus, our whole approach and attitude towards our activities, towards the world, towards other human beings, and to the whole phenomenon of our own life. That is what is called yoga. And the first step is to remain non-attached. And non-attachment is possible only when we stop defining ourselves as these mere physical bodies. It's possible only if we stop defining ourselves as a mental or intellectual entity. If we define ourselves as something beyond that. Even if you are praying for God's grace, even if you are praying to God to heaven, you cannot be yogi. You can still be a seeker for yoga, but a person who is not established in yoga doesn't pray for going to even heaven. He prays for freedom. Freedom in the true sense of the term. Well, this ideal of freedom is not only in yoga. Freedom is the beginning of all noble human aspirations. Dostoevsky's interpretation of the three temptations that Jesus was subjected to. Normally in the theological circles, Jesus did not want to test or experiment with the ideal of Godhead. So Satan tempted him 3 times. Why don't you convert all these pieces of stones and pebbles into loaves of bread and distribute among the people, that I'll be happy. Oh, why don't you, I shall make you the emperor of the world. And then you jump from the top of from a high altitude to prove that you are son of God. Jesus did not accept any of the temptations, any of the temptations to make miracles. Interpretation by Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov is this. The Inquisitor says. The Inquisitor said, I don't go to details, but idea of freedom, how far it is important in spiritual life. Freedom is the beginning of spiritual life. If not freedom, at least the desire for freedom is the beginning of spiritual life. So in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, the 5th book, there is this famous fantasy poem by Ivan Dostoevsky, Karamazov. It is called the Grand Inquisitor, the famous version, where the cardinal, the setting is in 1618 Spanish, during the period of Spanish Inquisition. The cardinal heard that a man was going about in the crowd making miracles and helping the sick people, distributing good things around. So this man was arrested and put in the prison. At midnight, the cardinal comes to the prison and he had this man brought in front of him, and he tells, look here, we are not with you, we are with him, we are with Satan. 1600 years back, we tried to, we put to the cross, why are you coming back again to meddle with us? The cardinal is asking. And then Satan tempted you 3 times. You didn't agree with him, but we are with him. And the interpretation is, Jesus did not want people to follow him just as an act of gratitude for getting bread. Jesus wanted people to follow him by their own free will. Then only they can get spiritually elevated. The idea is that's new interpretation. More rational and spiritual interpretation. So, freedom in the higher sense, this yogic concept of freedom in the higher sense, you find in many of the world scriptures and the teachings of great spiritual prophets and teachers. But in the Gita, Lord Krishna says, this freedom is achieved by attaining freedom from the senses and not through freedom for the senses. And such a person becomes established in yoga. In this verse, for example, Dhyayato Vishayan Pumsa, we see different objects. They cannot touch us. You can live, as I said earlier, in the marketplace. Ramana Maharshi lived in a place where people were quarreling, but he was not affected. Then what really takes away our freedom? When the mind ponders over what is happening around us. It is mind that is the cause of both freedom and also bondage. It is not the senses. So, Krishna says, when we go on contemplating on different visual objects, audio objects, different sensory objects, then we become attached to them. We never develop a desire for anything that we don't think about. That's why dreams are nothing but fulfillments of unfulfilled desires. If we see something and forget that moment, we don't see them in dreams. They return to us in the form of memory or dream. These are 2 types of returning. Only when the mind is focused on those objects. So Lord Krishna says, through constant thinking or contemplation on different sensory objects, mind gets attached to them. And when mind gets attached to them, then mind develops a desire for possessing them. Mind normally follows 2 tracks in its attachment. One is a strong desire, the other is a strong aversion. Both are equally disastrous. That is the interpretation. Maybe it's not mentioned in this verse, but Gita mentions elsewhere. We can be attached to something not only through desire, through the mechanism of desire, but also through the psychological mechanism of aversion. See, when we have a very unpleasant experience, difficulty forgets. That is also an attachment. So attachment necessarily doesn't mean desire to possess. It means some kind of obsessive connection, inner connection with that experience, object, right here. So, in Sanskrit, it's called raga and dvesha. These are the 2 tracks of attachment. So, even if you hate somebody, that is also attachment. As strong as when we are deeply attached to somebody in a positive way. So, both are attachment. So, and then Lord Krishna says, then anchor. For attachment in the form of desire prompts us to work to possess that object. Attachment in the form of aversion or hatred keeps that mind constantly lingering with somewhere in a corner of the mind. Both creates anger. And then when anger comes, our mind gets completely perplexed. Our mind loses its balance. Anger and also its opposites. In a psychological sense, its opposite. Extreme attachment. Both can turn the mind out of balance. But Lord Krishna in these two verses refers only to attachment in the form of desire and delusion in the form of anger. Delusion can also be in the form of extreme happy experience. Similarly, attachment can also be in the form of extreme hatred or aversion. Anything that remains, that lingers in our mind as an obstacle in spiritual life, that is attachment. And then what happens? When we develop this delusion, when the mind is turned out of balance, we forget our true nature. Already we have forgotten our true nature, but any kind of anger, depression, due to non-obtainment of some desired objects, turns the mind out of balance and we lose memory. And slowly our discrimination, people lose their discrimination and everything is lost. There is a famous verse in this connection in some other scripture. It describes the state of a monkey who is already mischievous and restless, who has drunk alcohol, fully drunk, and is beaten by a scorpion, and again a ghost has possessed him. Kabiravi madiramatto saunmatto virchigena sandishtaha tadavi vichachagrasto vijeshtitam tasyakim brumaha is famous verse. This is it. My mind is compared to a monkey. And the monkey is fully drunk. And then already it is restless, mischievous, it is drunk. And then a scorpion has bitten it. And then a ghost has possessed it. That is the condition of an ordinary human mind, which is surrounded by different objects. By its very nature, mind is defined as dream consciousness in many modern psychological books. But in the old Patanjali system, mind is nothing but a phenomenon of different tendencies and impressions in a flux. And Vedanta defines mind as something, as a kind of conundrum, as a kind of paradox, full of two different types of tendencies, one positive, other negative. Anyway, it is an established fact that mind is by very nature restless, unsteady. Now, that mind, when it is dragged, when it is attached to different sensory objects, loses its balance, its memory, and it brings out degradation, because complete loss of discrimination leads to the downfall of human mind. That is shown here. Now we will continue this class, not next Friday. There will be no class next Friday. We will have class on the Friday, not 25th, but after that. So I shall read the announcement. We will not have class next Friday, that is April 25th, because of Shanti Asrama program the following day. The next class will be on Friday, May 2nd, 7:30 p.m. here. So please remember, there is no class next Friday on April 25th. The next class will be on Friday, May 2nd at 7:30. Now, if you want a discussion, I will be happy to substantiate some of the ideas, to give an elaborate description of some of the points I made. Anything, it can be a kind of informal discussion. Any question? Welcome. Please.
So, Swami, since detachment is not always easy to obtain, I mean, one of the practices I understand is to practice being an instrument. And how does this relate to the practice of yoga, practicing as an instrument?
I mean, when we practice the ideal of instrument, we look upon ourselves as an instrument in the hands of God. That is altogether a different approach in devotion philosophy. In fact, it is easier. That's what That ideal was practiced by many of the founders of religions. We are all instruments in the hands of God. So that way, attachment in both the forms, either in the form of extreme positive attachment and also aversion, both can be avoided. So that is in devotional philosophy. In theistic philosophy, in all established religions, this point is made. We should look upon ourselves as instruments of God. Sometimes children of God, sometimes slaves of God, as or as devotees of God. In Vedantic devotional philosophy, into devotional philosophy, we are advised to look upon ourselves as servants, friends, children, or even as seniors. That all approach is there. Navadhabati, 9 methods are prescribed in Vedantic tradition. That is this Sravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Pada, Sevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasim, Sakhyam, Atma Nivedanam. We should explain it. First we listen. We are just listeners, always glorifying God, praising His hymns, reading and contemplating His hymns. We are servants, and we are elderly people. So you can also practice. You can also look upon God as your wife, if you are male, or your husband, if you are wife. And if you want to look upon God, if you are an aged person, you can hear your child. God doesn't mind. So that's one thing. But in any Abrahamic religions, we are asked to look upon ourselves as either slaves, completely surrendered to the will of God, or as children, as in maybe Judaism and Christianity as children of God. But Islam is servant, surrender. Islam means surrender, that's right, the will of God. So that is possible in theistic traditions, but detachment in a higher sense is possible even by atheists or agnostics, as Buddhist tradition teaches. In fact, the ideal of surrender, the ideal of looking upon ourselves as the instruments of God, makes things very easy. Well, if something happens, you are responsible, not mine. But we should have this ideal not only when something unpleasant happens, but also when something pleasant happens. Both the cases, we should look upon God as the one who controls us and also as the instruments in His hands. But very important thing, complete eradication of ego is the first prerequisite for this idea. That's the idea behind. So if you are writing something with a pen or a pencil, the pencil should not assert its independence and freedom. The pencil should surrender itself to the person who is writing. Otherwise, you won't be able to write what you want to write. So the instrument should not assert its freedom or independence. That is complete surrender. Surrender should be complete. That's the idea behind it. Any other? Please.
So sometimes it seems to me when you're being steeped in attachments, it's hard to just be detached, right? So you're saying to focus the mind on a higher thing to attain detachment. So sometimes it seems also like I can focus on witnessing my experience.
Witnessing.
Yeah, the sense of that I can witness that. Because that's what I encourage when I work with children, I encourage them to, because I can observe what I'm doing and I can do it at the same time. So it's hard to just be detached. Another thing, it seems like to me, the obstacle to detachment is children. It's very hard being a mother figure not to have that attachment. So it's kind of confusing when you talk to people in the world about attachment. They think it's good. So I noticed I have trouble articulating that little part. So maybe you can clarify that. How do you handle
Yes. In fact, there is a very scientific answer to your question. Behind every attachment there is a desire. And it becomes a problem when we have desire for something which may not be very pleasant or which may be something very transitory. So Vedanta says you can sublimate your desire. Have desire for something higher, something lofty. That will gradually take us to real non-attachment. In fact, that is a prescription for all spiritual seekers. One can never practice non-attachment at the very beginning. It creates a lot of chaos. In fact, Gita gives a strong warning against the practice of non-attachment at the very beginning, before the mind is ready. Either it could create confusion or it could make us totally inactive. This is very important. Therefore, what is needed is we must have a desire or attachment to something higher, lofty, noble. It could be, for example, strong desire for spiritual progress. Strong desire, and make it our ambition. Reading, contemplating, thinking. Somehow divert the mind into a creative channel. Something into a higher noble ideal. That will gradually take us to a higher level, and that will take us to non-attachment. So the first step is to get attached to something high, something noble, something lofty. So that is the first principle mentioned. And after achieving your goal, after we have fully progressed, after we have accomplished something through this dedication, then we feel, oh, this is nothing. This is a matter of maybe a few years. It is not going to be everlasting. That's the moment when real non-attachment comes. So non-attachment is not really an idea that we should start practicing on a fine morning. We should gradually graduate. We should evolve to that stage. The first step is to elevate the mind, to sublimate the mind, to sublimate desire, sublimate attachment to a higher level. And that is the beginning of spiritual journey. Right now, mind is attached to so many things. So confusion, disharmony, and so many problems. Let it be, but let mind be attached to something high, something noble, something loftier. That is what is called sublimation of the mind, sublimation of attachment, sublimation of desire. That's the royal highway to the ideal of complete non-attachment. This is in fact, Gita gives a very strong warning. The teacher of Gita, Lord Krishna, and the verse is, Na buddhivedam janayed ajnanam karma sanginam. I'm not going to quote this beginning. Don't confuse people's mind by trying to preach non-attachment, that you should practice non-attachment from tomorrow morning onwards. It is terribly confusing. Either we have a total, we have conflicts in the mind. See, Gita says, Vedanta says, spiritual tradition says that we must be non-attached. But I'm always attached. Let me practice non-attachment today onwards. We won't be able to do that. It is psychologically impossible. And so there is a conflict between what we want to do, mean practice of non-attachment, and the real situation. So to avoid that conflict, the dilemma, Lord Krishna says, never try to practice non-attachment on a fine morning. We must slowly graduate to non-attachment. And the first step to reach the ideal of non-attachment is be attached to something high, something noble. And that will take care of our journey. And when we reach that goal, natural non-attachment will come to us. That will be easy for us. Very interesting. So sometimes students ask this question. We should be non-attached by examination. I tell them you should try to get the highest possible grade and make a aim high. Try to achieve something really great, noble, something worthy. And then when you feel that we have achieved something really great in the ordinary sense of the secular world, if that is done with some Vedantic ideas in mind, then gradually we will go beyond that stage. That is the beginning of natural non-attachment. In fact, mothers should bring up their children, inspiring them to achieve something high, noble. Students should study with a strong desire, with a strong motivation to achieve something noble and worthy, something positive, for their good and also for the good of others. So Gita is very psychological. It gives a very strong warning to people who may start practicing non-attachment all of a sudden. Because we can never really work without a sense of motive, normal human beings. So if that is taken away, there is total vacuum in the mind, emptiness. And then that creates confusion. So what to work for? Gita says we should be non-attached. But mind is not yet ready. So that could create conflicts, a kind of psychological dilemma. To avoid a problem, one should first sublimate the mind, sublimate desire, sublimate our goal, sublimate our attachment to something higher and loftier. That's right. Anything?
So I was saying about witnessing, sometimes it seems like witness the desire.
Witnessing.
And witnessing the attachment. Witness the mind going in and out. I'm sorry to identify more with that. Witnessing and actually.
Yes, in fact, this witnessing and the witness ideal could be practiced for mental peace. But, the problem is it doesn't provide us a solid philosophy of life. In fact, when we practice breath control, counting the breath or observing the thoughts and the breathing, maybe at that time we'll feel restful and tranquil within. That could be practiced. But along with that, this yoga ideal also should be practiced. So yoga first asks us to work for something higher, noble, something lofty. And then says, even if you have achieved everything, still, if the mind is fully obsessed to the results of what we are doing, there will be an element of anxiety, disharmony, and unhappiness. That could be removed only through this mechanism of non-attachment. So one can practice this. I know that it is not possible, at least keeping this idea in mind once a while if we read it. See, all the problem we are facing is due to too much of attachment. So the only way out of the problem is non-attachment. This need not be put into practice all of a sudden, but this idea should be kept somewhere in the mind. So when at the end of the day, when we become depressed, Gita says, Vedanta says, non-attachment is one way out of this. So at that time it will strike us. When the metal is, when it is hard, if you beat it, it can take shape. When the mind is ready, immediately it will take the lesson. So that's a very important thing. So this idea should be kept in mind. We should read, we should contemplate, and when there is a dilemma, when there is an unpleasant situation in mind, this can help us. One method Vedanta says is, If you look upon all these empirical, secular, phenomenal things as transitory, non-permanent, that itself is a great solution. Behind every problem of anxiety and depression is the feeling that that unpleasant situation is a lasting situation. If we can keep in mind that it won't last for long, it will vanish. The world itself is in a flux. It's a metaphysical truth, but metaphysics may be too high at this stage. The simple fact, well, you have to take these unpleasant experiences in our stride. Everything is in a flux. Nothing is permanent in this phenomenal world. It's a fact. That helps us to practice non-attachment. But this ideal of non-attachment should not be experimented all of a sudden. It could be very risky because it creates a vacuum in the minds of those who normally function and work with a definite motive, who plan their work very well, who do everything. The ideal yogi is one who plans his work very well, who has a definite motive, everything, but he is not attached. That's why there's a quotation was absence of objects, absence of desire, absence of work is not yoga. In the midst of work, we must be able to practice non-attachment. In fact, it is easy that the real yogi is one who practices non-attachment in the midst of work. So,
does one have to start with a non-attachment to who they think they are to begin with? Like if a person is still attached to the idea of themselves as this name and form.
Those who have done a lot of selfless work for long years, they will find it easier to practice non-attachment. Those who have done selfless work, not for their own things, they may have faced depression, anxiety, but not for their own individual things, for others' sake. They can practice non-attachment. In fact, that's the lesson that Krishna gives to Arjuna. Real non-attachment is for the active person. An active person who normally has sublimated his desire, working for others, working for some good things for the world. So much attachment, strong motive, working for others. That person slowly graduates to the next level of spiritual growth, complete non-attachment. Another thing that I mentioned in the last class, non-attachment is the only psychological solution to the problems of work. Every work is inseparably related to some inconvenience, some problem, some drawback. No work can bring complete happiness. If at all it produces the expected result, next moment it would be that result may change. So there is no lasting happiness in the form of work or its result. So naturally we find non-attachment is the only way out. We cannot run away from action, we cannot remain inactive, because as I said, in the last class we mentioned, even if we try to remain inactive, we cannot. Gita says, even if you sit quiet in an easy chair doing nothing, still mind will be always worried about different things. That means mind is active, the body is not active. So, and at that time when we are worried about things, we are working as slaves. So better try to make an effort to work as masters. And we can work as masters when we are non-attached. Attachment reduces us to slavery, and non-attachment breaks these chains. We can be free, we can be masters of the situation and still be active. That's what Gita says. So we'll have the next class on May the 2nd.